On a cool, biting, misty morning, up in the swaying constellations of leaves, in a forest that looks from above more like a deep green ocean, on the sixth largest island in the world, a young female orangutan's day begins in the canopy, not on the ground. She's moving through the upper branches of a tall fig tree, her weight bending each limb in a rhythm she learned from her mother. The forest below is a mosaic of deep green and sudden openings, dark oil palm blocks, thin ribbons of road, a river that now runs past bare banks where peat swamp once stood. Somewhere far off, a chainsaw whines, then stops, leaving the insects and dripping leaves to reclaim the soundscape. For her, the forest is a series of choices. This branch or that one. This cluster of fruit or the next tree over, where the canopy stretches but does not quite touch. To cross, she must feel the branch flex, shift her center of gravity, and leap. In places where the forest has been thinned, the gaps are wider now, and the leaps more challenging. Some that used to be possible aren't anymore. She comes to one now. And so, before she starts the frustrating process of climbing down to the forest floor, she pauses, scanning for a route that doesn't exist anymore. She does that much more often than her mother did, and her mother before her. I'm David Maroney, and you're listening to the Wild Systems Podcast. Each episode, we look at a conservation effort from somewhere around the world. We dive into the ecosystem and uncover the systems that drive it to endure in a changing world. We look at how conservationists are putting their finger on the scale to influence those systems and the true data behind whether or not that effort is succeeding. I want to ask, why do conservation efforts succeed or fail? How is the wilderness there being impacted? And how would the effort look from the perspective of those wild creatures we're trying to protect and preserve? Today, we're looking into the Sumatran orangutans of the Leuser Ecosystem and the battle being waged in their forest all around them. In the distance, beyond the remaining tall crowns, the edge of the Leuser ecosystem, approximately 10% of the Indonesian island of Sumatra, is clearly visible from above. A hard line where the forest gives way to a neat geometry of agriculture and drainage canals. This is not the dense, unbroken rainforest her ancestors knew. It is a forest that has been cut, burned, replanted, and threaded with roads. A forest that now needs to learn how to bend without breaking. Long before palm oil appeared on shipping manifests, before maps drew straight borders across the island of Sumatra, there was a continuous, breathing expanse of tropical rainforest stretching from lowland peat swamps to steep, cloud-dimmed ridges. Days began there with a slow whitening of mist, cicadas winding themselves up like distant machinery, and the smell of wet leaves rising from the forest floor. The area we now call the Leuser Ecosystem covers more than 2.5 million hectares in northern Sumatra, a single uneven green body that folds together river catchments, peat domes, hill forests, and cloud-draped mountains into one connected system. From above, it looks almost solid, a rough, dark fabric of canopy. From within, it feels like a series of narrow corridors, roots, trunks, branches, threading light and shadow into a maze. At its lowest elevations, along the coast and in the floodplains, peat swamp forests once dominated, waterlogged, dark, and dense, with towering trees anchored in deep, spongy soils that held both carbon and memory. The air down here is heavy and close. Every step lands with a muted, sucking sound, and the world smells of mud, tannin-stained water, and slow, earthy decay. Buttress roots rise shoulder-high, slick with moss, while the ground level presses in with ferns and lianas, a long-stemmed vine, that brush anything that walks by. In the stillest hours, sound feels distant. A drip, a wing beat, a soft splash where something unseen slides off a partially submerged log. Moving inland and upward, the ground firms, and the forest opens into mixed dipterocarp trees growing in mineral soils. Rich fruiting trees that feed hornbills, gibbons, and orangutans. Here, the canopy lifts and breaks into layers. Broad branches throwing cool, shifting shade. Mid-story branches freckled with epiphytes. Gaps where shafts of white light punch through and paint the trunks in bright stripes. You hear the forest before you see its residents. A hornbill's wing beats like slow bellows. Gibbon calls, ricocheting through valleys. The muffled crack of fruit dropping from somewhere above. The air is warmer, less stagnant than down below, flavored with the sweetness of ripe figs and the sharp green scent of crushed leaves. Higher still, hill and low mountain forests wrap the slopes in cooler, mist-laced air, feeding rivers that tumble back toward the lowlands in cold, tea-colored streams. As you climb into the hills, each breath tastes thinner and cleaner, edged with the faint chill of stone and water. Leaves grow smaller, branches twist more tightly, and moss softens every surface into a damp, velvety skin. Clouds drift low enough to snag on ridgelines, so that trees appear and disappear in slow, gray curtains. And the forest around you seems to inhale and exhale with the passing fog. Underfoot, the soil is springy with decades of falling needles and leaves. This is one of the only places on Earth where critically endangered Sumatran orangutans share a single landscape with Sumatran tigers, elephants, and rhinos. For orangutans, the structure of the canopy is everything. They are the largest arboreal mammals, evolved to spend most of their lives above the ground, reading the forest, not as a map of trails and rivers, but as a three-dimensional web of trunks, branches, and empty air. From their perspective, each day is a sequence of decisions about distance, weight, and risk. Which branch will flex but not break? Which branch offers a safe crossing? which gap is just a little too wide. In intact forest, emergent trees rise above the general canopy, like islands. Feeding platforms, sleeping sites, and vantage points where an orangutan can settle into a nest of leaves and watch the light change. Lianas and overlapping branches create an invisible network of bridges, paths woven from wood and habit, memorized over years. Human use of this system has always been a part of its story. For generations, local communities hunted selectively, gathered forest products, and farmed small plots along rivers and valley edges, working to the rhythms of rain, river height, and soil fatigue. Villages sat where the forest thinned, near the water, where mornings began with wood smoke and the sound of birds carrying over fields, and evenings ended with frogs calling from ditches and the low rush of distant streams. The forest responded with resilience. Floods came, and the force of the water was slowed and softened as it came by peat and roots. Rivers swelled and then cleared, the banks looking much the same afterwards. Wildlife moved through large home ranges, crossing ridges and valleys with soil ever far below and branches usually within reach, following scent trails, fruiting cycles, and inherited roots. In that earlier pattern, orangutans learned to read a canopy that stretched almost without interruption from horizon to horizon, a continuous, shifting architecture of branches that told them where food was, where danger lay, and where the forest was still whole. So what happened to this paradise that now the Sumatran orangutans are critically endangered? There wasn't so much of a turning point as a series of cuts. In the 1980s and 1990s, industrial logging and plantation expansion surged across Sumatra. Forests that had once been written off as too remote or too wet suddenly became reachable, while at the same time timber prices climbed, logging machinery improved, and political priorities swung towards extraction. In Leuser, the first big losses came in the lowland forests and peat swamps, where companies moved in to clear land, sometimes with permits, often without, to plant oil palm and fast-growing pulpwood trees, and to drain and burn peatlands for farmland. Only later did parts of this landscape receive formal recognition and species legal status, and even then, destructive activities frequently went ahead in defiance of those rules. Each logging road that pushed into the forest set off a chain of events that would become familiar to those watching with the forest's health in mind. First came the heavy machinery and crews. As the roadbed dried and hardened, small shops appeared at the edges. Hunting increased, and scattered work camps grew into more permanent settlements. Researchers now describe roads as the first cut in frontier forests, the initial incision from which wider deforestation, poaching, and fragmentation spread outward. For orangutans, the damage was not just a matter of less forest, but of a fundamentally altered forest. Large peat swamp blocks that had supported unusually dense orangutan populations were drained, cleared, and burned, erasing nesting trees and safe resting sites. What remained was increasingly carved up into isolated fragments. Forest incursions were so overarching that the Sumatran orangutan population has declined by half since 1980, and still, one analysis suggests that more than half of those remaining survive in forests under the control of timber, mining, or plantation companies, rather than in fully protected reserves. Satellite imagery and conservation assessments indicate that around half of Sumatra's natural forest cover has vanished since the mid-1980s, with hundreds of orangutans lost every year to habitat destruction and hunting. By the time conservationists began to use the phrase orangutan capital of the world for parts of Leuser, they were already speaking in the future tense. Leuser sees roughly 85% of all remaining Sumatran orangutans, making it both a sanctuary and a possible single point of failure. If this forest system were to unravel, the species would likely not recover in the wild. Although parts of Leuser had been set aside as reserves under Dutch colonial rule, the forest was not treated as a single protected whole until much later. In 1980, Indonesia declared Gunung Leuser, a smaller part of the current Leuser ecosystem, a national park. In 2004, the wider Leuser ecosystem was recognized in law as a national strategic area, giving it special legal protection because of its biodiversity and role in regulating water and climate. In practice, enforcement often lagged behind the bulldozers, and the same period saw rapid expansion of logging roads, plantations, and speculative clearing around and sometimes inside these boundaries. Early conservation responses tried to close that gap between law and reality. Rangers and community patrols focused on the most obvious wounds: illegal logging, land clearing, and encroachment into zones that were now formally protected. Legal teams went after companies carving oil palm into forest land. Advocacy campaigns tried to convince both local officials and global brands that Leuser should be off limits for further expansion. Park managers and local NGOs worked to mark and defend boundaries, weed out illegal plantations, and begin restoring patches that had been burned or logged. Yet enforcement alone could not mend the pattern that had already formed on the ground. Some orangutans now lived in tiny islands of trees, hemmed in by plantations, feeding along drainage ditches, or in thin strips of remaining forest. In northern Sumatra, specialized teams, such as the Human Orangutan Conflict Response Unit, created in the early 2010s, began to focus on these edge cases. They tranquilized stranded orangutans and moved the healthy animals into larger forest blocks, like the national park, and taking injured or starving individuals to rehabilitation centers. Between 2012 and 2017, the Human Orangutan Conflict Response Unit evacuated more than 100 orangutans stranded in this way. Conservation thinking gradually shifted towards connectivity. Rather than treat each fragment of forest as a separate emergency, planners started mapping corridors. Corridors in Leuser show themselves as strips of habitat that could still allow orangutans, elephants, and tigers to move between core areas. Projects propose closing or rerouting new roads, replanting critical gaps, and restoring tens of thousands of hectares of lowland forest and riverine buffers, the vegetated strips of land along rivers or streams that are such crucial areas in this ecosystem. Some efforts focused on orangutan-sensitive palm oil, pressing companies still championing this product near the forest. Other efforts strived to keep or regrow riparian areas where treetops could meet again above the water. From our female orangutan's position in the canopy, these policy shifts appear more as patterns. A line of trees left standing along a river where the rest has been cleared. A plantation, a barrier in the canopy being hastily constructed, generating the operational stench and racket, and being suddenly abandoned, slowly giving way to secondary forest. A road that stops short of a ridgeline instead of cutting across it. For an orangutan that chooses her route by tall treetops and continuous branches, each of these small human decisions can mean the difference between being trapped on an island and being able to roam the expanse of the forest. On the ground, policies take quite the route to become a pattern. Rudy is a smallholder farmer who cultivates a narrow strip of land at the edge of the Leuser forest. His days start early, with the humid air already heavy by sunrise. Oil palm fronds rustle above him as he walks the rows, checking for fruit ready to harvest. His plot is legal, part of a landscape that mixes community land with larger concessions. To him, the forest is both backdrop and boundary line, a place that holds memories of hunting trips with his father, and a frontier where wild animals can step into his fields. In recent years, Rudy has noticed more signs along the edge. Broken branches, stripped fruit, nest constructions high in the remaining tall trees near his land. Orangutans, he is told, are passing more often now. Habitat loss and fragmentation push them towards forest edges and into disturbed areas where fruit trees planted by humans or secondary vegetation provide food. He does not see them every day, but their presence is written in damage. A snapped palm, a trampled sapling. One evening, as the light thins and insects begin their layered chorus, he looks up from his work and sees her. The same young female orangutan, perched at the edge of the forest wall, watching his movements. She shifts her weight carefully, testing a branch that leans out over the first row of palms. He freezes, hand resting on the rough trunk, calculating the loss if she drops into his crop versus the risk if he tries to chase her away. For decades, farmers in similar positions across Sumatra have sometimes responded with violence, killing orangutans seen as pests. Many even started capturing infants to make a little extra income in the illegal pet trade. In many cases, the economic margin is thin. A few destroyed palms or a season of reduced yield can feel like an existential threat. At the same time, the law treats orangutans as strictly protected. Harming them often means penalties. These opposing pressures create a very thin line for Rudy to walk, and thin lines are sometimes difficult to balance on for long. Programs working in and around Leuser have tried to widen that line. Some focus on education and conflict mediation, helping farmers understand both the legal risk of killing orangutans and the long-term ecological role forests play in stabilizing water and soils for their crops. Other programs are starting to create incentive structures, support for agroforestry, or assistance with diversifying livelihoods, so that conservation is not just a restriction, but a source of tangible benefit. Yet for someone like Rudy, the daily calculation remains immediate. This tree, this season, this risk. Up in the canopy, the orangutan does her own version of that math. The palms below offer fruit, but it looks like they're going to require a descent, an exposure to open space. The remaining forest behind her is safer, but thinner than before. She hesitates, then pulls back, choosing another route along the edge, disappearing into a tangle of creepers and growth midway up the forest edge. For this evening, loss is avoided on both sides. The tension, however, remains. For a long time, orangutan conservation across Sumatra suffered from a basic problem. No one knew exactly how many individuals remained, or how fast their numbers were changing. Estimates were extrapolated from nest counts, under conditions where the forest itself was shifting under the surveyor's feet. Over the last decade, field biologists and conservation groups in Leuser have changed how they count and track orangutans. Instead of just tallying animals they see, they now use a tactic called a line transect. They walk straight paths through the forest and count the nests they find along those lines. Then use data on how long nests last in different forest types to estimate how many orangutans live in each area, from primary forest to disturbed and logged areas. Satellite and drone imagery add another layer, mapping where the canopy is still tall and closed enough to form continuous roots through the trees, and showing that orangutans actually do use degraded forests, but clearly favor places with high, even crowns and few open gaps. These results make the story more complicated than a simple tale of forest good, plantations bad. Orangutans show a striking degree of flexibility. They sometimes travel along the ground, move through selectively logged forest, and hang on at low densities, even in landscapes dominated by plantations, especially where small strips of river forest or clumps of hilltop trees remain. But that flexibility has its limits. When habitat is chopped into tiny, isolated patches, small groups become more vulnerable to inbreeding, and features like roads, drainage canals, and wide blocks of monoculture still act as hard barriers that block movement and gene flow. At the scale of the whole island, conservationist modelers warn that if current rates of habitat loss and hunting continue, Sumatran orangutans could slip below the point where they can survive as a wild species within a few decades. Leuser, as the largest remaining stronghold, becomes a kind of global hinge. What happens here has outsized weight for the future of the species. Recent reports of slower deforestation inside parts of the ecosystem offer some hope, but slower deforestation isn't exactly the best news we can hope for, and even then, the trend is uneven and fragile. It can quickly reverse if new roads, fresh concessions, or political shifts open up previously quiet areas. And as we know about statistics, however valid they are on an aggregate population, it's hard to see how they apply to our young female orangutan. From the system's point of view, the question is, can conservation tools, patrols, stronger laws, restored corridors, and orangutan-friendly rules for palm oil and other commodities slow the loss and breaking apart of habitat quickly enough to keep the species above those critical thresholds? But from her point of view, it's if, by the time she's ready to raise her own offspring, there is still enough continuous forest to hold a home range, with reliable fruit trees and safe nesting sites, and whether males still roam within reach. So how do we decide whether Leuser's orangutan conservation is working? One way of answering looks at the measurable outcomes. Have illegal plantations been evicted from protected areas? Knowing that roads are our first indicator of damage, have key road projects been paused or rerouted? Are there fewer documented killings or captures per year? In some zones, sustained campaigning and legal action have led to the closure of specific illegal operations and a decline in deforestation compared to peak years. Local patrols report fewer fresh stumps in certain patrol blocks, and satellite imagery in some analyses shows a slowing of forest loss in targeted areas. Another answer looks at the more qualitative features. Have important corridors remained open? Are relocated orangutans surviving and reproducing in larger forest blocks? Are community-based programs around the edges creating conditions where farmers like Rudy can tolerate occasional crop loss without resorting to lethal measures? Here, the data is mixed and often localized. Conflict response teams report hundreds of successful rescues and releases. But each rescue is also evidence of a structural problem. An animal trapped in a habitat fragment too small to sustain it long term. In this category, we don't see anything that can be described as consistent positive results. Then there is the question of wildness. If orangutans endure only because patrols walk the boundaries, lawyers argue over maps, plantations are scanned from space, and supply chains are inspected in distant offices, what kind of freedom is left in that forested system? Once survival depends on constant human attention, has the place slipped into semi-domestication, closer to a curated exhibit than an ecosystem that can truly act on its own? But stand on the edge of a clearing and watch a wild orangutan decide whether to cross. When she freezes at the sound of a motorbike, locks eyes with the farmer, or chooses a route out of fear. That moment of recognition is also a measure of how far we have reached into her world. We tranquilize her, move her to a better valley, stitch a narrow corridor across a plantation so she can walk the same path year after year. How different is that from the flock of sheep we steer across a pasture? How wild is that? On a scale from a pug asleep on a couch to the ancient mammoths roaming pre-civilization North America. To capture and relocate a wild animal is to trade one kind of risk for another. We save a life that would likely be lost at the edge of a plantation, but we also mark that animal with our choices, where it may move, whom it may meet, how its genes spread through the population. The wild spirit does not vanish in that moment. She still builds her own nest, chooses her own mate, solves problems in a canopy we can barely navigate. But it is narrowed, channeled, bent around the scaffolding of our roads, our corridors, our laws. On a crowded planet, almost every living thing now moves somewhere on a spectrum between the pug and the mammoth. A flock of sheep follows a shepherd's call. An orangutan follows a line of forest we deliberately left standing. Both lives are bounded by human intention, but not entirely defined by it. Wildness, in this view, is no longer the absence of people or even the absence of management. It is the degree of room left for non-human minds to act, to choose, to adapt inside the constraints we have already built. If that is so, then the question shifts. It is not simply, should we capture and move them, but how much freedom can we still carve out for them, even as we intervene? A patrolled, litigated, satellite-watched forest will never be the Pleistocene North America of mammoths and giant sloths. Yet within its mapped and monitored boundaries, an orangutan can still vanish into the leaves, choose a path we did not predict, and look back at us with a gaze we cannot fully comprehend. That small remainder of unpredictability, of self-directed life, may be all the wildness we have left, and all the more reason to protect it, even if doing so means admitting we are part of the system, not outside it. In Leuser, success and failure of conservation likely hinge on scale and time. Protect a single valley while allowing roads to carve through the ridges above, and the system will eventually fray. Slow the deforestation for a decade, but fail to address underlying economic incentives, and pressure will return when markets or politics shift. We need to start working to close major frontiers, reverse illegal encroachments, and restore corridors. Only then the forest's own regenerative processes can take over much of the work, thickening the canopy and reweaving some of the broken threads. The measure of success of the system is not whether every orangutan is safe, but whether the Leuser ecosystem retains its capacity to absorb change without crossing thresholds that lead to irreversible collapse. For orangutans, for large mammals, and for the human communities downstream that depend on its rivers and climate buffering. That is a much more demanding standard than survival. It asks whether wild character, not just an endangered species, can persist. Near dusk, our young female orangutan builds her night nest. She chooses a tall tree at the edge of a small ridge inside the remaining core forest, away from the nearest road and out of sight of the oil palm blocks. Pulling branches toward her with slow, deliberate movements, she weaves a platform that will hold her weight through the night. Below, a stream threads its way through roots and fallen logs, carrying leaf-stained water towards fields and villages far away. But the canopy around her is not as continuous as it was in her grandmother's time, but here, at least, the treetops still touch. Somewhere beyond her sharp hearing, decisions are being made. A court case over an illegal concession. A new spatial plan that could either formalize a road through a forest or cancel it. A company board debating whether to enforce or relax a no deforestation policy in its supply chain. None of these will appear in her memory. What will matter is whether 5, 10, 20 years from now, her daughters can still find enough trees to move, feed, and nest without dropping to the ground more than they must. The Leuser ecosystem remains one of the world's most irreplaceable protected areas, in part because it is still a single system where river, peat, hill forest, and mountain refuge are tied together. Yet that system is now threaded with constraints that did not exist before, roads that cannot be easily removed, plantations whose owners and workers depend on their yields, a global market that still rewards cheap palm oil. Conservation in Leuser, as in so many places, is a negotiation over how much the system can absorb without losing the very qualities that make it unique. Right now, though slower than we were, we're still losing. As darkness thickens and insects take over the soundscape, the orangutan settles into her nest. Her world has always been one of balance between branch flexibility and body weight, between reach and restraint. Now the forest itself must attempt a similar balance between human needs and non-human lives, between extraction and protection, between fragmentation and connectivity. The question that lingers over Leuser is not just whether orangutans will still be here in 50 years, but what kind of forest they will inhabit if they are. I want to close today's episode with a Rudyard Kipling poem, The Way Through the Woods. It wasn't written about the Leuser ecosystem or even about a similar forest, but it lends a hopeful view to what successful conservation in the Leuser ecosystem might look like. As you listen, imagine our female orangutan in 20 years. Swinging across what used to be a road in the branches of new, young trees. They shut the road through the woods 70 years ago. Weather and rain have undone it again, and now you would never know that there was once a road through the woods before they planted the trees. It is underneath the coppice and heath and thin anemones. Only the keeper sees that where the ringdove broods and the badgers roll at ease. Yet there was once a road through the woods. Yet if you enter the woods of a summer evening late, when the night air cools on the trout-ringed pools, where the otter whistles his mate, they fear not men in the woods, because they see so few. You will hear the beat of a horse's feet, and the swish of a skirt in the dew, steadily cantering through the misty solitudes, as though they perfectly knew the old lost road through the woods. But there is no road through the woods. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wild Systems podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a comment. If you want to read the article for this episode, go to the Ecological Resilience Project's website. Join us next time as we explore another inspiring story from the natural world.